Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Hydragons Breath Bow Wow, welcoming you back to the Chaos series. Moving right on along to Cults, Demons, and Warbands of Khorne. Now, just a little reminder that our homebrew drive number 2 is up and ready on the channel. Highly recommend people drop their homebrew ideas in there. And another little reminder, we are running a side challenge running up to the first year anniversary of the challenge of the channel, trying to create new demon engines that are uniquely Slaanesh or Tzeentch themed, because they really don't have any, which is quite unfortunate. So, moving on to the main event. Khorne's Warbands, Cults, and Demons. This is going to be a pretty straightforward one, as of course, Khorne as a god is relatively straightforward. Now, I've gone into his worship, I've gone into his worshippers, but let's talk about his actual real space forces. His connection with his real space forces is relatively unique. Because Khorne is such a powerful deity, arguably one of the most powerful and one of the most numerous outside of those who worship Chaos Undivided for the most part, Khorne has many followers in real space. Arguably, the best of the warrior classes within the universe have the highest chance of falling to Khorne, because Khorne himself represents such a purely mortal concept, both the idea of martial power and martial strength, but also justice, courage, and murderous rage, anger, and hatred. So, he has a lot of people following him. His general demands are very well spoken in his oh-so-famous creed: blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne. Now, I've gone into and broken down exactly what that means and what his actual worship may form as in his god video, but that, for the moment, will serve as a guiding light to us, as it does to many of the actual cults, warbands, and of course, his demons, as we saw with the chip off the old block theory from that video. So, once more going into these, why are we generalizing? Why are we going over each of the gods and then undivided in this way? Mostly for Khorne, it actually helps me weed out a lot of very, very particular examples. So, in particular for Khorne, he has a lot of human cults that worship him for very, very different reasons. Now, there are Khornate cults of justice, of warriors, of flame, of blacksmiths, of craft. He's much more like Sauron than Satan or Lucifer, in that many people can follow him for many different reasons, but at the end of the day, they have a very consistent theme: blood and skulls, blood and skulls. So, well, that's why we generalize. Because there are so many specific examples that I can go into, I need to create at least one baseline so that everyone knows the entry level of his worship, so to speak. And finally, his breakdown of demons, humans, and mortals in real space. Now, Khorne draws a lot of mortals to him. However, I would like to point out that Khorne has a particular penchant for having immortal space marines turn to his worship from Imperial worship. Now, I'm not going to say that Khorne has an outsized role in the traitor chapters, or that he is necessarily the be-all, end-all, the first to get a handle on their souls, but it is absolutely notable that amongst all of the traitor chapters, a large number of them worship Khorne. I believe this is mostly due to the whole warrior archetype thing. Those who do not obsess over perfection, but rather obsess over effectiveness, would go after Khorne rather than Slaanesh. And of course, a Space Marine being a living weapon, well, he can really only fall to a couple of categories unless there are outsized effects upon his body and on his worship, like Tzeentchian sorcery or Nurglite despair. So, it is interesting in that he has many Marines. The other unfortunate thing is that they tend to be very aggressive. And thus, let us say that the turnover rate for Khornate Berserkers is relatively high. They are not a long staying power force on the battlefield, generally, certainly not against other Marines. They tend to expend themselves, so to speak, rather violently and incredibly quickly in large numbers. So while they are effective, certainly, they also do not have the half-life that, say, Plague Marines do. Demons-wise, Khorne is also very well known for summoning large numbers of demons relatively easily. His greater demons, due to the fact that he has so many of them and they are so directly involved in combat, they are not that difficult to summon at times. The main driver of this is essentially they are Khorne. They are parts of him, and thus arguably more easy to conjure than some of the more complicated thought-form demons. Again, you'd have to go into my theology video to go watch the whole chip off the old block theory, but again, he's got lots of demons. They're not incredibly complicated. They're very simple. They don't use a lot of complicated tactics, and he's got lots of Marines. Where then do the mortals fall? Well, even with those numbers of Marines, and even with the ease of summoning his demons, I still argue that Khorne has more mortal worshippers than any other Chaos God at one time. Specifically, because he grows them far more quickly. The auras and effects that Khornate Madness and Khornate Rage have on people can turn completely unwitting individuals into full-on devotees with very, very little time in between. It is terrifying how quickly a hive or a city can just devolve into outright massacre and bloodletting, with random civilians murdering their family members or shooting up the local businesses. It's disturbing, but at least the good thing for the rest of the universe is that these Khornate worshippers don't tend to last very long. Much like the Space Marines, their half-life, so to speak, even though they are usually raised in record numbers, is relatively short. So while he may be able to grab the most mortals at one time over the entirety of the Imperium, if we were counting heads, he would have the most, but if we are saying how many at one time or how many he holds on to, that's a very, very small number over the millennia. So let's look at the most fun part, in my opinion. I often like to say that I prefer Chaos Mortals to Chaos Space Marines, and that is almost always true. There is one minor exception. I have an unbelievable love for Khorne's Terminators. The Red Butchers are probably up there with some of my favorite units from all of 30K and continued onward in the World Eater Terminators of today. They're definitely up there with the Atramentar, not in terms of effectiveness, just in terms of sheer, that is how you should use Terminators. They should be the most shock and awe force available in the entirety of the galaxy. And I think the World Eaters use them remarkably well, or at least they used to. I'm not sure about anymore. But let's start off with Khorne's Warbands. First off, Legion. Now we have the World Eaters. These are the sons of the Red Angel. They are Angron's sons. They are the children of Nuceria. They are the many, many berserkers who were arguably created by Angron's implantation of the nails into his legion. Now their relationship with Khorne is, shall we say, physiologically inclined. Those who have had the nails implanted within them, which, by the way, is a fairly good number even to this day because it is kept as a Legion tradition in some warbands, and then, of course, in some sectors of the actual Legion, now that it's been reformed, the nails physiologically, prepare one to become a Khornate worshipper. The electrical pulses sent by the Butcher's nails into the brain, constantly twitching, constantly tweaking at the autonomic nervous system, constantly giving you what is essentially miniature seizures, are really, really annoying. And it's not just an annoyance that you can ignore, or something that you can drug out, or something that you can completely ignore with training. The Butcher's nails are in the skull. They are deeply embedded to the point where it's very difficult, if not impossible, to remove them, with some of the worst examples of removal being lobotomies or something else that we're not going to talk about, because that book is, well, enraging, but some of you have heard me talk about that before. We will not talk about it here. That is for another time, for silly GW writing. So, they are physiologically inclined. Those who do not have the nails, and this is a very interesting thing, there are examples of World Eaters who are using Loyalist Gene Seed and who are brought up basically outside of the Legion or outside of the influence of the Warp and the influence of other World Eaters, and they grow up relatively normally. And by grow up, of course, I mean mature into full-blown Space Marines. They are relatively normal. But then if they are reintroduced to the Legion, it seems as if they fall more quickly. Whether or not they have the nails installed, and whether or not this is some affectation of the affection that Marines have for their Primarch, I cannot confirm, but they seem to fall very, very quickly. So, arguably, all of the corruption and all of the relationship between Angron's sons and Khorne himself naturally inclines them over time. Now, of course, another interesting thing is demonic nails. Now, demonic nails, or arguably you could call it warp madness if you wanted to, is something that we see on some of these pure Marines, the non-Legion Marines, who then fall to Khorne. They are blessed, cursed, with a constant feeling of anxiety, fear, or even pain when not in active combat. Now, this could stray from something very normal, like, for example, you have Uzas in the Night Lords. He's a devotee of Khorne, and he's unnaturally bloodthirsty. He's uncomfortable when he's in the drop pod. He's fidgeting with his chain axe. He's just itching to get into combat. That's not normal. That is absolutely an affectation, perhaps of Khornate worship, but also perhaps of relationships with the World Eaters. Anyone who knew them, anyone who interacted with them, and perhaps anyone who even comes near them, may be eventually under the influence of Khornate corruption. And of course, this will only get worse as you continue spilling blood, and arguably, it can eventually become a substitute for the nails themselves. If you were to have a Marine who was raised clean, and then was either adopted by the World Eaters, or was raised as an experiment, or because they didn't have nails at the time, arguably, the corruption would do what the nails already do, but without any of the technology. Now, of course, that is purely theoretical. We do not have any actual examples of a pure Marine joining up with the World Eaters and then him experiencing something like the nails as almost a physiological or a psychophysical effect upon his body, but it is an interesting theory as to why people tend to fall so quickly. Perhaps Khorne is building off the architecture of the nails in his blessings to his Berserker worshippers. For it is in fact true that that Berserkers are not limited to the Sons of the Red Angel. World Eaters are not the only Berserkers in the galaxy, and there are other Khornate Berserkers who do not stem from Angron's seed, so to speak. Whew, that was a lot. Sorry. I have a lot of theories about these guys. Organization-wise, they are reformed companies at best. I can't truly call the World Eaters a legion. Even though they are reformed, they are some of the least reformed legion, if that's understandable. They have the worst organization, the worst logistics system, the worst command and control systems, and arguably some of the absolutely most fractious leadership available to any of the reorganized legions. Worse even than the Death Guard, there are many heads to this serpent, unlike the Death Guard, which only has two for the most part. So they are reformed companies at best. They will listen to Angron, and they will reply to him in rough company strength, but their targets are more dictated by Khorne, arguably, or the Warp at large, than they are dictated by Angron's wills, because, of course, Angron's will is no more. Angron's will is the will of Khorne, which, of course, is the will of the Warp. I refer to this as the Warp-Willed Crusade. Basically, the Warp-Willed Crusade is the concept that when Angron is summoned, or when Angron is thrown somewhere, when he appears upon a planet, and all the red death and raining blood and the horrible psychic effects and the demons that come along with him, when all of that nightmarish shit pops off, the World Eaters are basically following right behind him, whether they are following with him in the warp directly, whether they are finding him in the warp very rapidly because of Khorne's design, because of course chaos can afflict and affect ships in warp travel, allowing them to travel more or less quickly over time. So they could be getting drawn to him by that Warp-Willed Crusade. They could also be following him around very closely, either in the warp or on whatever, the Conqueror, whatever ship he has at the time. And then the other side of this, outside of the Warp-Willed Crusade, where they will land and break like a sudden summer storm upon any random target that they happen to get thrown at, is the eddies of that same crusade. Now, there are groups of World Eaters who do not spend all of their time in the warp, for obvious reasons. You need time to rest and recuperate. Making new Marines in the warp is arguably much harder and less successful than making them in real space. So if you needed to recover, if you needed to repair, if you needed to run some limited logistics, especially when working with other forces like the Dark Mechanicum, some warbands need to stay in real space in order to do those things. And so there will be ripples out from the attacks of the World Eaters. There will be a massive incursion with Angron and 5 to 6 companies, thousands and thousands of World Eaters, and then they will destroy the planet and drop back into the warp and disappear for a while. But there will still be 2 to 3 large warbands just echoing out around the area, just going around, coasting in the local planetary space, looking for prizes, looking for ships, cleaning up the leavings of what the Legion left behind, etc., etc. Essentially, they will be the logistics runners for the Legion, as much as that goes. But that's enough about the World Eaters, because God knows they are a mess as a Legion. What about the non-World Eater Berserkers? Well, for example, here I have the Brazen Beasts, but non-World Eater Berserkers. This is a little bit confusing, and it relates to unintegrated warbands or semi-integrated warbands. Non-World Eater Berserkers are those purer or non-World Eater specific warbands that are worshippers of Khorne. The Brazen Beasts are an example. They are not World Eaters, though of course some of them have the Gene Seed or the training of World Eaters, but they are not all World Eaters Gene Seed. They are not all World Eaters stock. They are not necessarily followers of Angron in any way. They are direct followers of Khorne. And they do this by selecting an archetype of Khorne to embody. And this is common to universal amongst all of these non-World Eater Berserker bands. Now, for the Brazen Beasts, they copy one of the demonic cohorts of Khorne. Like Slaanesh has legions, and, Nurgle has plague hosts. Khorne has his demonic cohorts as well, his own legions, so to speak. They copy one of them. They essentially select one that they would like to emulate, and thus they copy it. Now, this is very much in combination with the concept of demonkin. Now, demonkin are a mix of possessed, demons that hang around the warband, in this case, obviously Khornate demons, but it is a very semi-ephemeral phenomena, especially with smaller warbands. It's difficult to keep demons around for an extended period of time without some level of sophisticated logistics. And of course, with a Khornate warband, you could have some logistics, but sourcing tens of thousands of sacrifices to keep demons around is rather tough. So, these demonkin, they are essentially ways to source and ways to keep around demons for a longer period of time. Both because having demons around you while you spar or raid or whatever attracts the eye of Khorne, because of course his followers are there and his demons are there. That is far more juicy than just the followers. But also it gives these warbands some forces that don't need nearly as much logistics. Demons don't need resupply. Demons don't need rearmament. Demons get stronger the more you fight and the more you succeed, which means that they are a very useful force for one of these medium to large warbands. In addition to that, you will also see things like Possessed. You will, of course, in the case of the Brazen Beasts, see large numbers of demon engines. So, lots of demon engines and lots of berserkers. That's kind of their shtick, again, copying the demon cohorts of Khorne and the demonkin. But the other important thing is, these guys are a large warband. They're a Hulk warband. A Hulk warband basically means that they've taken over a space Hulk, and they use it the same way that a normal warband would use a Grand Cruiser or a battle cruiser. Now, it's not nearly as effective as a combat vessel as one of those ships would necessarily be, but it is still pretty damn hard to destroy, and all that the Brazen Beasts really need is the opportunity to drop a bunch of demon engines and berserkers onto a planet and then pick them back up again. And if a massive demonic war Hulk or a Hulk, a space Hulk, will be able to do that, then why not? It takes relatively low upkeep and relatively unsophisticated upkeep, and they can also rely upon the will of Khorne, or the will of the gods rather, to send them through and out into real space where and when they are needed. So, just another example of it's very different when you cleave away from the World Eaters and you look at what Khornate worshippers are in the warbands beyond them. They're generally pretty large, as I mentioned, often trader chapters, but also sometimes collectors and dregs of the fallen and of, disaffected world eaters, so to speak, like the Brazen Beasts. They'll pick up whoever is around who likes to spill blood, and they will incorporate them into the demon kin, willingly or unwillingly, in whatever case it may be. And then finally you get unintegrated, or technically, I guess, a slightly better way to describe it is semi-integrated warbands. These are Khornate mercenaries. I mean, if I have to explain it in the simplest of ways, they are semi-self-reliant, meaning that they have their own leadership and they maintain their own traditions and war gear and whatever they need. They have berserkers and non-berserker marines who worship Khorne. Now, non-berserkers who worship Khorne. Like I said, the infection or the mental physiological inclination of Marines to fall to Khorne doesn't always manifest like the nails. It tends to do so with the World Eaters, but it doesn't always have to do so with others. So there can be, quote-unquote, right-minded, Khornate Space Marines. It can happen. We have Azariah Kairos as a good example of this. But he arguably would be a non-World Eater Berserker as well, because he and his warband are also technically a Hulk warband, so it would be up to you to argue that. The main thing I want to point out with the integrated warbands is that they are corrupted rather than legacy, again, usually not related to the World Eaters in their entirety, and oftentimes they're trader chapters, and they make up a relatively small portion, less than half, of other warbands, but they are very, very potent. These are often applicable to like the old 30k warrior lodges. It is a cultural brotherhood within another group of Space Marines, whether it be Black Legionaries or whether it be anyone, really. Trader chapters, the folks who look up to Khorne and who worship Khorne within another force could arguably be considered an unintegrated warband. When things go bad and when they have enough converts from the quote-unquote regular Marines to go along with them, Zerker or no, they can cleave out in a ready wake across the galaxy and spill blood in the name of Khorne alone rather than working under someone else. So let us move on to the mortals, cults of Khorne. Generally, there are two ways that cults of Khorne start. There is the strongman method. The strongman method is when some feral brute or some monstrous strongman, some macho libre gentleman decides that he wants to flex and might makes right goes through his society. Now, this can happen in a lot of different ways. Might makes right is an application that can apply to gangsters, that can apply to feral worlders, that can apply to feudal lords, that can apply to planetary governors, that can apply to civil war, that can apply to gang war, that can apply to murder. It can apply to many different things when we talk about might makes right. But the strong man usually relies upon just that, the in individual. It is Mr. So-and-so, it is our great Lord so-and-so who's going to lead us to victory. Why? Because Khorne deems it so. Because he is so strong, because he is so gifted, because he is so blessed, and of course, at the end of the day, because he is so goddamn angry. So, the strongman method works in a lot of scenarios, but it is, let us say, blunt. And it is heavily reliant upon that one guy remaining sane and not making a mistake that ends with him getting shot in the back of the head. So, the strongman method is common, and it's relatively easy, because God knows every military commander or even feudal barbarian chieftain certainly thinks that they have some level of ego worthy of perhaps being followed. So they can all start a Khornate cult if they feel like it, it's just God knows which one of them is actually going to succeed. And then the second half is a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more crowd source rather than crowd fund. Master of the Hunt and Master of the Hall. Basically, a figure of authority begins a movement fighting back against the system. The system writ large is the Imperium of Man, the Administratum, but the system writ small could be taxes, or it could be being brought up for the Imperial Guard, or being beaten in the streets for being poor. It could be anything. Anything that is seen as oppression. There's often a phrase said amongst the Blood Pact, troopers of Khorne fight for freedom. Why would a feral world cult give a shit about freedom? Well, because it's freedom to worship. It's quite literally, in their minds, freedom of religion, freedom from the lies of the God Emperor, freedom from the yoke of the imperial faith, and freedom to be as they already were millennia ago. So, the idea of not just one man fighting for his own ego, but now one powerful individual creating around themselves a powerful social, political, and most importantly, militant movement against the status quo. Now, these are usually militant in nature. It's very rare that you get Khornate followers handing out pamphlets or doing complicated political or economic theater in order to win power through a bloodless coup. No, this is like actively trying to rile up the population to go attack the PDF and murder the planetary government. It is very overt. Now, there are subtler versions of this, and there are versions that take longer. In my opinion, some of the common ones are getting certain high-level individuals on your side, which we'll talk about later, or in another video, rather. And then, of course, finding a scapegoat, finding a person, finding a patsy that you can put all of this hatred towards. Usually it's going to be the leader of the official military, while Mr. Strongman Mick, Master of the Hunt and Hall, puts himself in that person's place and says, look how good it could be if only I was in charge. Gotta love it, it's such good logic, it never fails. Now, what are we looking for amongst these gentlemen? Well, it's not as unsubtle as Zeech in terms of being obvious chaos, but it is certainly more subtle, it is certainly less subtle than some. Arguably, Slaanesh is one of the most subtle, and Nurgle would come secondary to that, because at least all of Nurgle's blessings and curses are relatively biological in nature. Khorne is different. You will see unnatural or impossible strength. The 150-pound twink should not be able to bench press 250 pounds. That is some impossible warp fuckery shit. That should not be happening. So when you see him pumping iron at that weight, you might want to question what gym he works out at, because the dojo master in charge is probably a Khornate worshiper. Icons or slogans. Now, this is not icons of Khorne, necessarily, but you will often see with Khorne many, many, many duplicitous representations of the warrior. Now, the warrior and the warrior monk, something that is a basic concept throughout the Imperium, because of course we all know about the god emperors Angelic Astartes, and we know that they are glorious warriors. Why not look up to them? Why not look up to the Imperial Guard, our own great warrior defenders who are mortal? Well, these icons and slogans, these concepts that are normal and accepted in society, can be twisted for Khornate use very, very easily. A great example is, yes, the Imperium loves the iconography of the skull, because the skull represents both mankind, it also represents, memento mori, remember death, remember duty. Now, it can represent both mankind's purity and its unchanging nature, and memento mori, it can remind you of death, but it can also represent skulls for the Skull Throne, and that concept of death, that concept of mass death, and arguably even of suicide in cases like the Kith, can be taken to an extreme. And of course, even the Blood Pact, an openly and outwardly chaotic organization, even their slogan isn't too far off from what we would expect an Imperial Guardsman to be shouting. Troopers of the Emperor fight for freedom certainly does sound like an acceptable motto, but change one word and oh by golly, that's a problem. So, Troopers of Khorne fight for freedom, Troopers of the Emperor fight for freedom. It only takes one word to change the meaning of the phrase. And of course, when we're talking about duplicitous symbols, we're not doing it in a cowardly, backstabby way. We all know what it means. You're just not in the know yet. Of course, use of bones and brass were not really needed. One of the big ones is that Khorne is big on ornamentation. Weirdly enough, I would argue Tzeentch is the most flashy, but at least Khorne truly does believe in, bulk. Everything is big, everything is oversized, and it is really for shock value and for shock factor. Big weapons scare people. Big muscles, big bodies, big everything scares people. Khorne knows this. Khorne knows that without all of the subtle hints and maledictums and magnifications of his enemies, he has to rely on something. And if being big and scary is what he has to rely on, then let's do it. Bones and brass, baby. It's gotta be everywhere. Skulls hanging from the armor, giant skulls hanging from my helm, giant heads of people I've defeated hanging from my massive axe. It is an ostentatious, come and fucking get me, very much a brash, bold, courageous move when you see Khornate worshippers going to this extent to show off, essentially. That's often why they don't have shirts on. That is literally show off the guns. The 9-inch pythons are what's going to scare the crap out of my enemies. The next two are a little bit more uncommon and probably more related to cult armies than they are to cults. Cannibalism, partaking in the eating of human flesh and human blood more often, are near ubiquitous in very open Khornate cults, of course. Even the Blood Pact do, time to time, drink blood. And of course, they paint their uniforms with it as well. But they're also self-harm as well, cutting the hands and the face and gouging out parts of the eyes as shows of loyalty. So cannibalism, or auto-cannibalism, or arguably even auto-damage, like hurting yourself, self-harm, could be examples of Khornate worship, and arguably self-harm could be also a symbol of Slaaneshi worship, but we'll get to Slaanesh when we get there. Then, finally, you have horns and bull/dog features. The hunting hound and the brazen bull are very strong icons of Khorne. If you were to genuinely take an actual brass bull, that would be an icon of Khorne, a deific icon of Khorne that you could worship in and of itself. Now, Khorne is always represented as black, right? He's got the black armor, the heavy iron stuff. Why then does he care about brass so much? Well, I believe, or at least I am of the opinion, that the metals that Khorne chooses are specifically in representation of his worship. You have iron, the hardened backbone, the common man's mineral, the common man's metal. It's not steel, it's not sharp, it's not clean, it's not subtle, it's not easy to work with, it's just brutal, up in your face, heavy, and difficult to use. That's the other part of the iron, is that it's not as easy to use a steel, or it's not as easy to use a heavy iron axe as it is to use a steel axe. It requires more skill, more physical strength and power to use the great axe of iron rather than the one of steel. And brass, of course, brass then is a representation of iron mixed with blood. It is a representation of a strained alloy. It is a mixture of two weak things, mankind and the concepts therein, and then Khorne, a powerful thing to create something beautiful and yet fearsome. It is a bloody red. It is a russet, brassy tone. And of course, it is brash. It is bold, like trumpets and like tubas, like a great number of hunting horns are the brass armor of Khorne. So I often relate it in that way, just the color and the metal and the icons being in a relation to Khorne's own worship. It's often, in my opinion, why skulls are sometimes dipped in weaker metals, such as gold or even such as silver, because they are representations of the weakness of the fallen in comparison to the victor. But now we're getting into truly theoretical territory rather than something that I can actually prove. Now, how do they seek to succeed? Well, there's the overt method and the overtest method. So the overt method is direct military conflict. We are going to kill the motherfuckers who stand in our way. Whether that is us murdering the guys who are standing in the way of our strongman, or that is us as a group, as a society, as a culture, as a cult, coming together to unseat and to uproot the system and the status quo that has thus far bound us. A central goal of Khornate worship is, of course, blood and skulls, death, mass murder. There is less value in taking a world without bloodshed for Khorne than it is for any of the other gods. The other gods make more use of the living than they do of the dead. Khorne makes use of both with near equal efficiency. Now, of course, he prefers his followers to be living, but rather, unlike the other gods, he makes followers very easily, and he discards them just as easily most of the time, unless they are particularly skilled or particularly blessed, but we'll worry about that later when we get to the armies. And then the overtest method. The overtest method is we are throwing out all of the normal human stuff entirely. We are going into direct combat, but we're adding in Khorne's will. We are summoning his demons. We are bringing on the chaotic forces of the warp to bring down the foe. Whether that is blood raining from the skies as we charge, whether that is fires burning through the entire hive as we run amok, or whether that is demons and beasts and monsters of the hells stalking the streets and beheading the weak and the hapless amongst them. It does not matter, only that the gutters fill with blood. And of course, the overtest method throws off any pretense that this is a civil or an internal or a non-corrupted uprising. It is very obvious when the bloodletters start running around and doing what their name suggests that they can do, that this is chaos. The archenemy truly revealed, and of course, unlike the other gods, for Khorne, revealing is the whole damn point. I didn't want you to stalk in the shadows and kill people. I wanted you to wear my icons and show my brass and show them the guns while you cleanly and hopefully effectively lop the heart from this bloody Imperium. That is the hope, after all. So what would they have? In a standard cult, you will have large numbers. So I put around 30,000 with improvised close combat weapons. These could be anyone. 30,000 angry psychopaths, 30,000 Oprishnik-style prisoners, 30,000 workers, 30,000 cultists, 30,000 mutants. I can go on and on. It doesn't matter who's holding the lead pipes and the swords and the axes. It only matters that they are in large numbers and that they are directed towards the people we don't like. Then, of course, you'll have an equally large number, around 10,000 heavy or large close combat weapons. Now, when we talk about large close combat weapons, of course we think of axes, of course we think of swords, of course we think of hammers, but now I want you to consider this. Take anything, a street sign, or a light pole, or a lamppost. Break it down enough, and you have weapons that can be used by Khornate followers. They are gifted with unnatural strength and power, and what is more, many of them are already quite strong. For example, if I gave half of a telephone pole, a 15-foot length of solid log, and I gave it to a Khornate Ogryn, a normal Ogryn would have a hard time wielding that. The Khornate Ogryn will still have a hard time wielding that, but the difference is he's willing to try. And he's willing to rip his muscles and strain his back and put all the rage and all the hatred he possibly can into it. And maybe at that point, it doesn't matter how talented he is at swinging the lamppost around. He's probably gonna kill whatever he hits. And it may get destroyed, it may get busted, but all he has to do is grab another one. So these are almost disposable weapons in some cases, but of course the classic big hammer, big axe, big sword will also be prevalent on worlds where those are available. Industrial tools where they are not. On top of that, you will usually have 10,000 assault troops. Now, these assault troops are essentially the only troops that are going to have true mixed weaponry. Now, they're going to have shotguns, pistols, rifles on occasion, auto pistols, stub revolvers, big, brutal, simple weapons in many or most cases. But the important thing about Khorne's troops is they will almost never be without a close combat weapon. Even these assault troops, even these more elite cultists or acolytes who are intelligent, conscious, and well-trained enough to use a ranged weapon, they're not using it like a PDF soldier. They're not using it like a guard trooper. They're essentially emptying the magazine at anything that moves and then sprinting at it with an axe and trying to chop it to pieces, or running at it with its bayonet fixed and then emptying the magazine into the body that you've just impaled. These assault troops are very, very short term. They are really, really not designed for trench holding or for complex military maneuvers. They are laughable in terms of actual traditional combat power, but paired with the close combat units, paired with the heavy and light improvised weapon groups, they can stud assaults, and they can fill in to more aggressive roles in large numbers. Remember, there's not going to be a lot of suppressive fire in this cult. I'll be talking about that in a second, but the assault troops will serve that role in a small capacity. Commonly, the last two you will see are small firepower units. Now, I'll go into more detail on what these firepower units are, but they are essentially whatever assets or gear or heavy weapons that the cult has access to, or that they can strip, concentrated into very small groups, less than 100 men, and then thrown in at particular strategic points. An example of this, and a cult may only have one of these. A cult may collect a couple hundred explosives, say a couple of homemade firebombs and grenades, and then they may strip a hive of 2 or 3 artillery guns, a heavy bolter, a couple of machine guns, and a flamer or 2. All of these explosives, all of these heavy weapons, and the couple of light artillery pieces will be in one small, tight, packed area, and they will roll along with the assault, and units and groups of defenders that have been dealing all day with the close combat weapon troops, or even with the assault troops, will then suddenly come under withering fire, granted poorly organized and randomly effective, but still heavy suppressive and sometimes anti-tank fire from these nodule stud units that are in very small numbers, but are invariably used to gain localized fire superiority advantage over the planetary defense force. Remember, a couple of artillery pieces, some flamers, and a heavy bolter, that is localized fire superiority over a force that has bolt-action rifles, or even semi-automatic rifles. The PDF are usually not that well equipped with heavy weapons, unless they're emplaced. So on the march, or when in trenches, or entrenched within a city, a couple of flamers and some heavy bolters is the firepower advantage that most cults need in order to effect a breakthrough. And that can be done with these little units. In addition to that, usually you will have a robust bodyguard. Normally amongst human cults, you will see large numbers of bodyguards. Where Zeech may have 10 to 30 psychically inclined individuals, or like Deamons or something. Nurgle might have a little unit or squad of 10 to 30, and Slaanesh will probably only have a small cohort of less than 20. Khorne, you will see units of 100 plus as bodyguards for the demagogue. This is mostly because of the sheer volume, and often the volatility, of Khornate cults. We can't have someone getting it in their head that they can kill the boss man and put that whole might makes right thing into effect. So we need a large number of loyal followers in order to keep that guy alive. So let us move on to the cult armies. How then do they start? Well, they can start in the way previously mentioned, but there are two other ones I would like to move on here. One, traitor regiments and traitor military forces. Now, I put military forces there specifically to include the PDF and private militaries. Now, we've talked about private militaries when we talked about the PDF. I know it was a long video ago, but a lot of you guys have seen it. The PDF are one military force on a world. Then there are enforcers, then there are arbitrates, then there are local police, then there are the higher level of the PDF, then there are training regiments. All of these can exist in various forms, but then you can have local armies. These can go from anywhere from fraternis militia groups to traditional armed forces of feudal worlds or feral worlds, all the way down to clandestine taekwondo training halls where the sensei is a Khornate worshiper. All of this stuff can happen, and arguably for that reason, it is the most common way for Khornate cults to start. They're not going to start holistically. It's rare that you get a Khornate cult starting out of the blue. You tend to need somebody who has some conception, even if it's just inspiration, that Khorne exists in order to truly put their hatred into effective use, so to speak. So, arguably these are the most common. I would also argue that they're usually at the heart of many seeming grassroots rebellions. Now, these could also include gangs. So you have folks that are like, we're a corrupted gang, but like we're only 50, 60 guys. Let's start recruiting. Let's start putting up fronts. Let's start faking a religion. Let's start organizing more into a cult from our original organization as a gang, and that is going to change the tenor and, of course, the tempo of their recruitment. So I would argue that these are the most common and probably the most successful way to get a Khornate army going. That also includes, the long military tradition. So, the long tradition of militancy. Rather than being a military force or a traitor force, so to speak, you can have the long tradition of militancy. Now, this goes more into the dojo where the guy has been a Khornate worshiper indoctrinating people secretly forever. But it also includes feral, feudal, and historic cults. Now, historic cults can be something like the Blood Pact. If they weren't on a planet that was already worshippers of chaos, they were essentially just a martial brotherhood of priests to begin with. And their long history and their considerable martial prowess is what both inclined them to Khornate worship in the days of war. Of course, they are an undivided force, but that is also because they've been around forever. They've been worshipping chaos forever. And this could be the case on many Imperial worlds. You could have a priesthood, or a sainthood, or even a local parish that has a group of monks who are remarkably militant. They're not dangerous, and they really only work on the defensive, so to speak, or so we know, but at the heart of it, these are military men, and they are won over by certain religious practices that might be questionable. And those religious practices will then lead them into becoming a cult army. On feral worlds, this is even easier because you can just outright be worshippers of Khorne who have been around forever and are just now hitting their stride, so to speak. On feudal worlds, this will often be individual houses or nobles who start to get influenced by Khorne and by warfare a little bit too much, and then they start turning and becoming far more culty than just traditional. But these are essentially a long military tradition that is then turned towards Khorne rather than a military force that betrays the Imperium for Khorne. They're kind of related at times, one can bleed into the other, but they cover the majority swath of how cult armies get started from scratch. What do you look like? What do you look for, or what do you look like as an acolyte or demagogue of Khorne in an army? Well, massive oversized muscles are the regular. At this point, we're not just talking about a 150-pound twink who's able to bench press 250 pounds. We're talking a Catachan worshipper who is massive and wrought with muscle, who can bench 350 pounds. We're talking about somebody who is physically overwrought with muscle and unnaturally strong on top of what his body can already achieve. Commonly, you will see blood iconography, whether it's red armor, whether it's red uniforms, whether it's brass, whether it's iron, anything, and especially the skull rune of Khorne becomes very common. There are hundreds of permutations of the skull rune of Khorne. Now, there are ones that are more complicated, there are ones that are more simple. My own faction, the Blood Pact, have their own version of the blood rune of Khorne. But the blood rune is very important. It's something that you carve, it's something that you cut, it's something that you mark to yourself, that you tattoo, that you carve onto your weapons, that you spray paint onto your armor. All of this stuff is important because, well, you're hoping for a mark of Khorne. Marks of Khorne are given out relatively generously in comparison to the rest of the gods, because all you really need to do is be marginally more successful than the rest of the fellows with you. You don't need to be in charge to receive the Mark of Khorne. And the Mark of Khorne has massive advantages for you. It gives you outright authority, it gives you blessings, and oftentimes it comes with resistance to psychic powers, which, yeah, as a Khornate worshipper, I would value that very, very highly. So the skull rune is common in the hopes that it will become a true rune of Khorne, blessed and empowered by him already on the flesh, or the weapons. How do they seek to succeed? There is one major through line with all Khornate cults. They take the mass doctrine, the huge numbers attack, the massive wave assault, the Soviet style of warfare, and then it is either led or followed up with overwhelming firepower, quote unquote, either close or long range, depending on what they have available. Now, this seems very simplistic and wide-ranging, because it is. Khornate doctrine varies literally person to person, depending on what they hate, what they're going for, and what they're angry about. But at the end of the day, we have a very simple strategy. Send in masses of ignorant and angry followers in huge numbers, in massive waves, and then either crack open the defenses ahead of time with something, or send in something elite at the end or at the beginning to ensure a guaranteed penetration of the enemy defenses. Or, on the opposite side, if we're talking about aggressive wars where you're protecting an area, well then Khornate worshippers are going to proceed to attack you with everything ranged that they possibly have, throw every single shell that they have at you, and then proceed to try and run you over with massive groups of assault infantry, which, Yeah, some real World War I stormtrooper tactics on display here, very, very commonly. Now, is it well integrated, well organized, or well planned? Well, it can be. You have the Blood Pact, who do combined arms very, very well, with a high reliance on both artillery, elite infantry, and aircraft, but then you have other cults that are not nearly as well trained, though many of them do come from that military history, so they may have a doctrine in place that is merely employed more aggressively, or arguably on a larger scale, when they fall to Khorne. So again, it is range depending, it is equipment depending, and it is arguably tradition depending as well. But at the end of the day, still mass doctrine. So what would they have in a standard army? About 100,000 autogun and close combat weapon cultists. You will notice the numbers here are massive for a reason. This is a doctrine, and this is an army that will take huge casualties. You can expect a 10-to-1 loss ratio against the Imperial Guard with these low-level chaff units. Now, that may apply to lots of different cults, but very few cults engage in open warfare with the Imperial Guard on such a regular basis. Most cults avoid that. Khornate cults do not. They actively seek it out at times for the hopes that they will be able to use it to summon demons. So, yeah, you can expect them to bring everybody and their mother to the fight. And the first unit they will throw at you is those assault cultists that we talked about before, autoguns and close combat weapons. And they will be augmented by the rest of the full court press, 100,000 full close combat weapon cultists. Often this will mean those big close combat weapons or two smaller improvised close combat weapons, chain dagger and a bayonet, two bayonets, lead pipe and a sword, sword and a mace, axe and axe, all of that good stuff. And these will be deployed together. 200,000 masses of cultists with overwhelming numbers and firepower expected to simply break upon a weakened or vulnerable enemy and probe and break into their defenses like a massive red wave. And then finally, 25,000 firepower units. These are very much the things that I described before, but in larger numbers. Flamers, heavy bolters, heavy stubbers, or autocannons are common in this scenario because they will maximize the anti-infantry firepower available to the cult and help to suppress defensive positions, which can then of course be assaulted by the assault cultists. These groups are usually going to be 1,000 strong, and then they will push in behind the tens of thousands of normal cultists. Then they will usually have at least one mixed, motorized, mechanized, or armored group, between 50 and 1,000 vehicles. Again, the 1,000 side is going to be more the motorized trucks and cars. Anything in the middle there, a couple hundred, might be mechanized and motorized. And then if you have a cult that has a real armored force, you can expect it to be no more than 50 to 100 Leman Russes, Chimeras, etc., because those are very hard to make and very difficult to come by in large numbers. And then finally, the common thing that you will see either as the vanguard or as the bodyguard of the demagogue is demons or demonically enhanced forces. Whether that is the most blessed from among the cult, those who have received the most, kindness from Khorne, the most recognition of their worship, or whether it is literal demons who are kept around the demagogue, essentially as his personal protectors. Now, of course, the demagogue is not sitting on his ass behind the lines. That would make demons very difficult to keep around, but what he is doing is running directly into combat just behind the first line of cultists, which means that the demons have plenty of fodder upon which to snack. So let's talk about them demons. Well, for the types and classes, we have the small boys, the bloodletters, and the flesh hounds. These guys are incredibly basic. They do what it says on the tin. Like I said in the Khorne video, they are built as pieces of Khorne, born without weapons and then smelted them within his realm. A big thing for bloodletters is that they have the armed and made not born concept. They are essentially going to be aspects of Khorne. One of the most important things that nobody really talks about is that while these guys are incredibly incredibly simple and they're incredibly straightforward, they all have something a little bit off about them. Bloodletters occasionally have the ability to teleport, or to shift their form, or to move incredibly quickly, which is just not normal, and nobody's really talking about that. Then you have Fleshhounds, which have incredibly good sense of smell and can act like bloodhounds. They are very, very effective as trackers for this reason, keeping the hunt ongoing and hunting down stragglers. On the medium size, you basically have what happens when you take those flaming thought forms in the warp and you gird them in armor. You have Juggernauts and you have Blood Crushers. These are basically armored rhinos. Already we talked about them in the warp engine or in the demon engine video, so arguably they are demon engines that are just normal demons as a rule, but the Blood Crushers specifically are a Juggernaut that is being ridden by a Bloodletter, oftentimes an Exalted Bloodletter or a Herald of Khorne. Heralds of Khorne are the large demons. Now, I generally hold that most Khornate demons are not incredibly smart. Now, they're able to converse, and they're able to talk, and they're able to, maybe understand you, especially if you're a Khornate follower. They might be willing to listen to you, but they're not the most subtle or complicated creatures. They are very much in the vein of, why are you talking to me when we could be killing people right now? They are of that type. And the Heralds of Khorne are the first real exception to that rule. They are able to plan, they are able to organize, they are able to make deals, and they are able to deal far more fairly with both humans and Chaos Space Marines than basically any of the others. This also applies to individuals who are exalted within Khorne. Because many of Khorne's demons, summoned in their mass multitudes, for their easy summoning, because there are so many of them, you need to have leaders, you need to have heralds, you need to have somebody who's helping organize the actual fight. And Lord knows the greater demons are not of any help. They are not very helpful at all. The Bloodthirsters are kind of a step backward in terms of restraint and tactical approach. They are pure force over function, brain function, that is. I'm not calling them stupid. I'm being kind of facetious here, but I am just pointing out that the Heralds of Khorne are the ones you want to talk to and deal with, unless you can manage to bind one of the Bloodthirsters and keep them still for a couple of minutes. They're like an angry kid with ADHD. It's just hard to calm them down and make them focus, man. They are on the hunt all the time. They don't often get out of the house, and they are very interested in spilling blood whilst they are here. Bloodthirsters are, by the way, some of the most deadly greater demons that exist. They are certainly some of the most damaging that can exist, and the auras of Red War and the auras of Rage that they bring with them are arguably responsible for turning many of the civilian population against the Imperium, more so even than the cult at times. The Red Wane, the Red Blood Rain, the massive psychic effect of Khorne's demons, the rage pox that goes through people is truly something to behold. Much like Genestealers, watching society crumble as all semblance of humanity is simply sucked out of it into the warp is truly a sight to behold. There is one primary way to summon Khornate demons: mass death. Khorne is well known for being rather easy to summon his demons. Bloodletters are numerous. They come in large packs. They are not hard, funny packs, GW models, haha, funny. But yes, they come in large packs, and they are relatively easy to open up the gate for. And of course, unlike other demons, which might want to entertain themselves in some other way, the Bloodletters have one thing on their mind when they get into real space, and that thing, of course, is to massacre and cause mass death. One person causes mass death and summons the demons go on and a chain reaction begins. The demons kill more people, it strengthens or opens more warp rifts, more bloodletters pour through, and the cycle continues, increasing in more and more volume until everything starts to look a little bit crazy. So what are they best at? maximum aggression and lack of restraint. They usually don't have ranged attacks. Some of them do. You have skull cannons and you have fire on occasion, or molten brass, or whips, but I don't really consider whips to be a ranged attack, really. I mean, 20 feet isn't much range. It's kind of the same range as like a melt-a-pistol. So, yeah, I wouldn't call that really ranged. But still, not really common. The other thing is that you'll occasionally see some, again, weird things. Resistance to magic is common. Resistance to psychic powers. Teleportation, on occasion. And then, of course, charges. A big thing with Khorne is the aggression on the charge. Literally, this is almost, again, a psychological warp affectation. When Bloodletters and humans fight together, or when Bloodletters and Khornate Space Marines fight together, it's weird. It's a strange mimetic effect, almost, that the demons seem to be encouraging the mortals. Not the other way around. It's not the mortals that are getting inspired by them or the demons that are getting fed by them. It's the demons themselves, their very presence, their very activity, unconsciously burgeoning up and enraging and inflaming the mortals and even the Space Marines around them. This is one of those things where I point out that Khorne has a lot of quote-unquote magic in his arsenal. Now, it's not psychic powers, it's not warp trickery, but it's definitely a mimetic effect that his demons have. Not to mention the whole teleportation thing, which again, you could argue whether or not you want to support that for Bloodletters. I think it's quite arguable. But still, people who say that Khorne hates psychers, or people who say that Khorne just hates magic in general, please go look through my Khorne video. I have a lot to say about that, and I will not go into it here, because God knows this video has already been long enough. How do they affect demon engines and items? Well, for items, they are relatively commonly an improvement of damage or strength. They are sometimes related to skill, but it's also usually because of aggression and strength. Pure skill for skill's sake, the ability to like go through forms or motions or look elegant and beautiful while fighting, Khorne leaves that shit to Slaanesh. They may fight over the people coming in, but once you're part of Khorne's army, you care more about efficient slaughter, murder, and your pure physical power than you do about being elegant or beautiful, for the most part. So, high skill, more in the efficiency rather than in the grace terminology. Again, I would say use with care, especially demonic gifts from Khorne. Use with care. He is a god that does not like to let go of people or things that he likes. And if you happen to be something that he likes, you want to be wary of those gifts, young man, because they can be dangerous. Usually his demon engines, as much as they are quite useful, quite powerful, and usually encouraging to his allies, they don't tend to last long. Not because, like Tzeentch's demon engines, they burn themselves out, but rather they are so purely aggressive, and they tend to throw themselves out so far ahead of allied forces that they tend to take a lot of chip damage that they don't necessarily need to. And their sheer aggro, while it works as kind of a bowling ball or a sledgehammer or even a wrecking ball type strategy where they can blast open defenses and bust through stuff just because they're so fast, so strong, so quick, so angry, it can also leave them unsupported and relatively easy prey for things like tank brigades or titans on occasion. So, you know, be aware of that. Fire them like a fire and forget weapon, or do your best to control them as best one can. It is quite difficult, especially for more dangerous, greater demon engines. So, some credit as we go along. Naturally, credit goes to GW and Fantasy Flight, Alex Boca, Frost Lazamon, Tilbut Oliver, Evan Shippard, Prater K, Diamond Daktan, Treylock, Tasmar, Redneck, FiQ, Albert Sargdan, Entry, and others. Sorry, the process for picking out all the art got very, very messy because I was doing this a little bit backward, but I hope that you guys enjoyed. There will be several videos coming out. I know that I was a little bit early with this. I'm trying to spoil you guys, give you a little bit more. I would also like to remind you, please go onto the Discord, jump onto the post channel, which I'm hopefully going to get into our new standard description box, and join in our homebrew drive. So far, I have maybe 8 to 10 different homebrew ideas, and only a couple for the Zeech and Slaanesh Demon Engine thing. I would really hope to beat our last homebrew drive, so remember, we're going to be doing live streams, we're going to be doing group stuff now that the channel's yearly anniversary is coming up. I was so happy that I got that Darktide video out, and you guys seem to love that. Don't worry, more Darktide stuff is coming. But again, I'd like to remind you, vote, post, go through the list, let me know what you wanted to see, let me know what you want to see out of the homebrew stuff. And of course, more Darktide is coming, so those of you who joined from that, I'm very glad to have you along. I hope that you all enjoyed this very special Khornate video. Glad to keep the Chaos channel up and running, and I wish you all a lovely good night.